So welcome back from spring break. Hope you had a lot of fun and are ready for our final poll for the rest of the course. We're well into the discussion of globalism now. We'll be talking about its dynamics from this point on. Midterms, I think, should be, everybody should have got his or her midterm back, and if there are any difficulties about anything you don't understand about the comments or grade or whatever with regard to the midterms, please get in touch with me. We can look the thing over. In fact, we can figure out ways to discuss the midterm in detail if you really need that kind of thing. And this would have to do with questions involving not just the content, but also problems you may have with writing. If we can talk about that, we'll figure out a way. Maybe we could do it by telephone. It might even be possible that way. But anyhow, do get in touch if you have any difficulties. I've had some good luck counseling about writing, and especially writing for history, and that sort of problem that students often come up with. So please get in touch if you do feel you need some counseling or need some discussion or explanation or whatever, or if you just want to argue a point. Do get in touch. And next we have a book review coming up at the end of April, and nothing really special about that, but it's designed to pursue a point that may have caught your interest at some stage of the course, and to pursue that a little bit further and look at a little bit of hopefully scholarly opinion if we can manage it. And then to write some commentary on that, write a short commentary on that. So that'd be about the same size of assignment, maybe outer limit 1,000 words, I think. We'll talk more about that as we go on. I'll write up something and let you know exactly what I have in mind for this book review project. All right, so last time we were talking about the first stages of what you might call a construction of a world order. So this happens pretty much in the Nixon administration. It's pretty much the work of Nixon and Kissinger. It's interesting that geopolitically, they are attempting to construct a world order based on the defeat of the United States in Vietnam and the attempt to, change the subject, to revert back to the Cold War. Remember that during the Vietnam War, the Cold War, the way we previously defined it, almost completely disappears. And so there's only the Vietnam War, as Kissinger tells us in his memoirs. That's all we thought about was the Vietnam War. There wasn't really any world politics, any foreign policy, except the Vietnam War during that period. So Kissinger trying to bring things back to the old track, get things back on the old track, and to use that in some way. Use the Cold War, perhaps revive the Cold War, revive the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, particularly, the nuclear relationship, and all of those things, use all those things. That's what Kissinger is trying to do, to establish a kind of what you might say, a world security framework. But we don't ever talk about the rest of the work that Kissinger and Nixon did, which is establishing this economic order by means of the oil shocks. By means of the oil shocks. A new economic order starts to be put together, a new global order. So we're talking about those things last time. What had we said? We'd taken note of this strange triangle that Frieden talks about, and this kind of rearrangement of all the money flows. It's all done through the oil shocks, all done by means of manipulating the oil price. So if we talk about globalization going into financialization, which we'll talk about more today, but much more when we get to Ronald Reagan, which is next time, we'll have to make reference to this stage in the process of constructing this world order around oil. So I think maybe I could start to use the term petroglobalism. In fact, I mean more and more. I like this term as a description of the course that we have, the era of petroglobalism. because the construction of the New World Order, it's a financialized construction, but the financialized construction is made possible through the oil price, So that is the essence, really, of the world order. So we're talking about that. Solvency in foreign policy. Now remember that solvency framework is don't do everything everywhere. Do only what you can do. Don't fight in Vietnam if you can't win in Vietnam anymore. Well, of course, they did everything possible to win in Vietnam, but they could not do it. And the rest of solvency is, have détente with the Soviets. We don't want a nuclear war. Regularize relationships, and they're really relationships of dominance, but they are dominance together with the Soviet Union in a reasonable relationship, holding the tensions down. I mean, we can't completely patch everything up the way Jack Kennedy would have liked to do, but at any rate, hold tensions down and enter into a kind of a push and pull with them over the question of how the world is going to change. That is to say, various wars of national liberation, as the Soviets would think of it, wars of class and national liberation, or struggles of class and national liberation, the way they like to think of it. And in the West, brush fire wars, they thought of it in the Kennedy administration. Regional conflicts, they're going to start to say, is something that can be negotiated with the Soviets. That's Kissinger's idea of linkage. So all this complex geopolitical and foreign policy thinking. That's not the heart of our discussion this time, but we have to see it as part of the picture. That is the thing that helps us to explain all these economic events, which, in my opinion, cannot be explained with an economic history that pays no attention to geopolitics. I mean, if you look at what Frieden is trying to do, it's tough going. It's a tough slog to try to explain everything he's trying to explain with purely market conceptions and purely economic history. All right, so that's where we are, the strange triangle, the oil shocks, and then the recycling that all these oil dollars that are made by the oil countries, so you see them here in various colors all over the globe, but you don't see how uneven the distribution is. It's mostly Mideastern oil that really counts in this OPEC picture of the oil exporters. And it's really Saudi Arabia is really at the heart of the matter. Iraq could be, Iraq has oil reserves that are almost thought to be almost at this time, and I think even today thought to be almost at the level of Saudi Arabia, and of course a very big producer in Iran. So yeah, those are the big ones, and then you have two radical members of OPEC, the Western Middle East, if we want to think of it that way, North African members of OPEC, Algeria and Libya. And so they are the radical members of OPEC, and they see the raising of the oil price, the oil shock. They see this as a way to reorganize the world for the third world. So they represent a kind of an attempt to maintain the leadership of a kind of a neutralist and internationalist Bandung kind of movement, and make this oil shock into some kind of a shock against the West and an attempt to reorganize the world by the non-aligned movement, by the third world. So we'll talk more about that today, and how the United States, and especially the work of Henry Kissinger and the Nixon administration, and Nixon and Ford administrations, how they headed that off, that attempt by the third world to use the oil shock to organize the world, and how they, in effect, got the big banks back in the position of organizing the world. So that's the major struggle that we will be discussing, is unfolding from this point on. I introduced that thing when I talked about Kissinger and Nixon. So the strange triangle, then, the oil shock, the recycling of the oil profits back into the big banks in, often they say the West, but it's really New York, it's really the United States. And then the United States, with all of this money, it has to do something with all of this money, and it parcels it out to the NOPECs, the countries who have to consume oil at these vastly higher prices. It parcels its money out in sovereign loans which are with adjustable rates that's set according to the London Interbank overnight rate. So those things can change if we change the interest rates. It's adjustable by the banks. How much is going to get paid back? Wow. It's quite an idea. And so you see that this forms a kind of a global system, a recycling mechanism, I guess I could say, following the language of Varoufakis, a recycling mechanism, a world order, a new economic order, basically. So it's all fundamentally on the oil price. Petroglobalism, I like to think of it as being. All right, so all on that basis, that thing is established by the Nixon-Kissinger administration. We've already talked about the basis of that thing. So today we're going to talk about the fine-tuning of the thing, reinstatement of the thing, and its adjustment. These things can't simply be imposed on the world, or nor can they be conspired at and done completely without any kind of how to put it, without any reference to what is actually going on in terms of the security relationships around the world, the things that are out in public and that are in the all in the media. So we talked about the beginning of that, and we talked about the security structure, the Détente and the SALT agreements, arms control agreements with the Soviets, ABM treaty, which says we're not going to protect ourselves, with anti-ballistic missiles, meaning we accept the idea of mutual assured destruction. We're both going to be able to completely destroy each other, and that's what deters us. In fact, that's the element of stability. We do not want to defend ourselves. If we defend, that means we're getting ready to fight. Want to do that, no fight. We want deterrence. So it's deterrence according to the notion of mutual assured destruction. This is kind of a huge step for the Soviets to drink this in, because the ideas about all these things were all cooked up in the United States, and Soviets never bought any of it for a long time. But now to engage in discussions with the United States and to actually arrive at parity formulas for nuclear weapons, the Soviets pretty much have to accept this doctrine too. So there's a kind of how to put it. We used to always talk about a learning curve on the part of the Soviets, meaning in effect the West kind of educating them about nuclear weapons. But it's such obvious stuff that has to do with the most basic threat of war and peace, and the idea that both powers have this huge ability to destroy each other and do not want to do it. Got to figure out a way not to do it, and to theorize. To theorize a whole doctrine of how they don't want to do it, a notion of deterrence. That'll take some doing. And so in a way, this is quite an architecture, quite an intellectual construction in the strictly geopolitical vein that was achieved, you could say, during the Nixon administration, Nixon-Kissinger administration. So that's stuff we've already talked about. A lot of this not made possible, I would say, but greased to a certain degree, enabled, assisted in various ways by the opening to China. So the Chinese are now slipping out of the Soviet orbit. Now, there's been a quarrel between Soviets and China since the 1950s, but it's a quarrel over pretty much how to maintain a revolutionary struggle against the United States. But now it starts to be something a little bit different. The Chinese are going to start to take the view, and they will take the view. I'll elaborate on that to some degree today. They will take the view that they don't want to see any more world revolution, especially if it means that the balance of world power is going to shift in favor of the Soviets against the United States. So their antagonism against the Soviet Union is now starting to impinge over into the area of their revolutionary internationalism. It's making them less revolutionary internationalists. We're going to indicate they don't like to see the Shah of Iran fall. They don't want to see this Portuguese revolution in Europe. And a lot of these events that you might say would be greeted by communists, revolutionaries, with enthusiasm, are greeted usually by the Soviets with enthusiasm, but not by the Chinese. So they're going to do this Chinese kind of antagonism, which is going to grow and which is eliminating the Chinese, how to put it, internationalism. You might say they're not really a revolutionary power, except in the sense, of course, that they're creating this dynamic economy. And that's the main thing that we'll be getting about by the end of today's discussion, this hugely dynamic economy. And insofar as it's socialist, I guess they would certainly maintain, oh, it's very revolutionary, it's going to change the world, it's going to be the biggest thing, blah, 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 blah. But is it actually aiding a world revolution, or is this a Chinese event? Has the nationalism component of the revolutionary message of the 20th century, has the nationalism component started to get into the driver's seat with China? That's a difficult question. In many ways, a question of questions, even today, continually discussed and debated, even in the era of Xi Jinping. But here we're talking about the era of Deng Xiaoping, so we'll talk more about that as we continue. And all of this reshaping of the world security system and the whole world economy around oil, all of this is being done under the aegis of a condominium of the Soviet Union. So that's quite a construction that's being done. And it's being done around these OPEC countries, and you can see that the OPEC countries, they're connected through various checkpoints. So only oil in the Mideast has to come out through the Persian Gulf, goes through Suez, goes through the Straits of Malacca to get to the Far East. Japan has no oil, so the oil that gets there has to go through the Straits of Malacca. And the US Navy is just about the only force. I mean, the Soviets certainly can't, Chinese can't, nobody else can. It's the only force that can really maintain the security of this oil transit. We see nowadays how important these choke points are. As we speak, there is a boat, a big container vessel with thousands of containers, that is to say thousands of rail cars worth of goods, and there's one boat, one ship, which is stuck in the Suez Canal now, and it's shutting down the world economy, basically, as we speak. So you get an idea of the importance of these choke points, so to speak. And the U.S. Navy is the only one who can really command the choke points. That's the fundamental thing about the world economy, that without the Navy and its grip on these things, the United States can't determine everything. So if you ask these mysterious questions as to why everything has to be done in dollars, or rather than some other currency, or some other related question like that in the economy, you can't give an economic answer. You got to talk about the importance of the American Navy and the control of choke points and its control of its vice on the whole world. And we see that very clearly in this period. And Kissinger has the idea, of course, that all of these changes that happened during the Nixon-Kissinger détente and all the rest of that, they're all going to be based on a Cold War that's more or less on ice in Europe, pretty much broken down the way you see it here. Very sharp delineation, well, with the exception of Yugoslavia, but a very sharp delineation between East and West, and all that's going to be pretty much, very, very stable, very dependable, and we negotiate across those boundaries. A lot of the conceptions of Nixon and Kissinger are along these lines. We're going to keep NATO in shape, and all of the mythology associated with all of these relationships of the old Cold War. But as a matter of fact, it's all changing during this period, and they can't do what they want to do. The American leadership can't do what it wants to do in Europe. It's got this Portuguese Revolution to worry about. It's got various leftist movements. It's got a hot autumn developing in Italy, a huge strike movement, big anarchist movement, big fascist movement on the right, things done by the intelligence agencies that, we could discuss and debate and, research, at length. Lots of changes going on in Eastern Europe, and not the old Cold War picture. Moreover, the Cold War partners don't take the same attitude of hostility toward the East during this picture. It's quite the reverse. They're changing things. Ostpolitik means that the West Germans want to figure out ways to deal with East Germans and have to play ball with the Soviets to do this. So, and you can't be a fierce Cold Warrior vis-a-vis the Soviets if you want Ostpolitik. So Kissinger recognizes a lot of this stuff. He says there's sort of a continuum between Gaullism, the attempt of the French to Sovietize, or excuse me, to Europeanize the Soviet Union, to get very little closer to the Soviet Union and to kind of buck NATO on that. Ostpolitik, second chapter, Gaullism, Ostpolitik, second chapter, Willy Brandt trying to, work out better relations with the Soviets in order to have better contacts with East Germany and all the rest of that. And then he thinks Détente is the last part of that thing. That's sort of a summing up of all of its prior stages. And as he would like to think, a cancellation, a cancellation of all of the prior stages so that the United States can run the whole thing. And hopefully, the way it's always been run. But you can't. Very difficult to do during this period. And the Europeans, remember, they're punished the most as a result of these oil shocks. So the oil shocks are really a weapon, a dagger pointed at Europe. Who leads Europe? Well, de Gaulle, maybe you could think of it, leads Europe in the 60s, certainly leads Europe against the dollar at the end of the 60s. And now the oil shocks are a blow against that, blow against the European campaign to undermine the dollar, to scramble for gold. That's going to continue during this period. We'll talk more about that today. That is usually not talked about very much, but it's very, in my opinion, very, very important, especially if you want us to understand the economic arrangements and the threats to this putative New World Order. We can't say that, big muckety-mucks in the Bilderberg conferences and blah, 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 that these people, they just blow a whistle and everything in the world gets to change exactly the way they want it. No, it's a difficult process in stages. And to be sure, there's architecture to it, but it's a thing that's got to be done through events and over time and through a lot of non-economic means, non-economic policies. The difficulty that we have with this, what you might call the first layer of the petroglobalism as established by the Nixon-Kissinger détente. And then what goes at that, there's communism in Europe now, the Portuguese Revolution and Eurocommunism, the European Communist parties, especially French and Italian Communist parties, now say that, look, if we have a socialist revolution of some sort in France or Italy, we're not going to be satellites of the Soviet Union the way, say, Poland is, the Communist Party of Poland. No, not going to have that. That's what Eurocommunism essentially says. If we're going to be communists, we have some kind of a historical compromiso histórico, such as the Italians advocate, combination with the Christian Democrats and some kind of communist Christian Democrat, revival of the tripartism of 1944 through 47. If we have some revival of that kind of thing, we're not going to be following the dictates of Soviet politics. And the Soviets criticize this Eurocommunism. They say it's not quite revolutionary. We want a real revolution in Portugal. So say the Soviets. Konstantin Zarodov is the big Soviet theorist on this topic, who thinks that there's going to be some kind of version of 1917 going on throughout Western Europe during this period. So very exciting, very tumultuous period, full of changes, and not simply the result of a blueprint or a conspiracy in the sense of actually being able to do anything completely privately, completely sub rosa on the sly. No. The world is going to change, but it has to be changed in public, and it's visible for us to see. And especially as historians, we can really look back on it and really see it. In terms of the events that were public, events that are known, not in terms of backroom conspiracies. not to deny that there are plenty of backroom conspiracies on every topic in the world, not to say that these things don't exist, but just there's no substitute. That is, say, talking about conspiracies, there's no substitute if we're talking about the actual politics we know about, the stuff we know about, the stuff that we can see on the surface. All right, so there we are with the problem. And I guess the first problem we have to contend with is the attempt of the third world to use the oil shocks to remake the world according to what you might call the new international economic order. Wow, new international economic order. Can you imagine that? So the big cheese in this campaign was Henri Boumediene of Algeria. Kind of an important fellow, not so much appreciated in the American press. The French press, of course, knew all about him. The French keep track of world affairs much better than the Americans keep track of them, and much more intelligently. American press is kind of fatuous and kind of, I don't know, full of itself and ignorant about a lot of things. French are a little better when it comes to these things. They're a little more shrewd. Maybe they overdo their shrewdness, but they kept track of things like this. So what we're talking about here is the OPEC left. That's the best way to put it. The OPEC left. So it's Boumediene for Algeria. Algeria, very, very socialist place. Even today, there's lots of nationalized property. Almost everything is nationalized in Algeria, and up till the events, the revolutionary events that overthrew Colonel Qaddafi in Libya. We could have said the same thing for Libya. And in the period we're talking about, in the 1970s, Qaddafi is pretty much the same category. So between people like Boumediene and Qaddafi, they have the idea that they're going to be able to rule the world. There's Colonel Qaddafi, very handsome guy and charismatic character, fabulous speaker, huge plans for all sorts of things all over Africa, imagines himself an organizer of African unity, and and here he's going to be an organizer of the whole world, because Libya is this huge oil state, and the rest of that. They have pretty good contacts with the other politicians in the Mideast. Here you see Gaddafi and Boumediene with Hafez Assad of Syria, and there he is with Sadat of Egypt. Egypt, not an oil power, but Mideastern power. And of course, the other conception of the matter is that this new international economic order is a lot of bunk, and we have to destroy it, have to beat it, have to foil it at every opportunity. And that's the big antagonism that develops between 1974 and 1976, just before Jimmy Carter comes into administration, the last days, you could say, of the Kissinger rule after the fall of Nelson Rockefeller from the vice presidency in 1975. So in 75-6, then, I guess you could say, this struggle plays out. Now, what are the two sides seeking? The OPEC left, they wanted a lot of nationalization in the world, nationalized industries please them, and nationalized oil they think is the wave of the future. Certainly correct. I mean, we'll go through the wave of nationalizations when we get into the 80s and talk about Reagan, about the oil order then. But the national oil companies are pretty much taking over. And what we've been calling big oil, they're going to start to be eclipsed. Now, the big oil is, the biggest ones, the Standard Oil, the British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, so all the biggest private oil companies, they're going to start to be a little less at the center of things. And we see a lot of nationalized oil. And we'll go through all these nationalizations. Anyhow, the conception of the new international economic order is oil nationalization on a large scale, and that's going to happen. So it's based on a certain reality in the economic thing. In fact, if this was only an economic question, you might say these people, this left of OPEC would have had a chance to organize the whole world. But it isn't all economics. The United States still has plenty. The United States still has that big Navy and nuclear weapons and blah, 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 and the rest of it. So it isn't going to be. It isn't going to be that way. But at any rate, that's their idea, nationalizations. And then they think raw materials cartels, producers cartels ought to be organized. And these ought to be, and OPEC is the model for the whole thing. The OPECify pretty much all of the major components of the world economy. And a lot of these economies, of course, it goes without saying, are going to be planned economies, and maybe even some planning across borders would be in order. State-to-state notions of economic planning, and it's that globalization model that is not a market model, about which we continue to speak, and we traced it back into the 19th century when we talked about the Anglo-globalization model. We talked about all the other possible national models and how they could have come together with an alternate model based on state-to-state relationships rather than market, world market, Ricardian relationships. But of course, it's not so easy to do if the states don't have enough power to do it. And there we have the essence, in my opinion, of the problem. And of course, this left-wing third world organization, the world economy around OPEC, has as its fundamental goal, I think, at the end of the line, formation of a world bank. So if they're going to be making all this money from the high oil prices, they got to keep most of that money. They keep a lot of it anyhow, even under the Rockefeller, Trilateralist, Kissinger, Brzezinski model. They keep plenty of money anyhow. The thinking of these third worldists around Boumediene and Gaddafi is that they are going to organize this thing in such a way as to create a bank that can compete with the major financial centers in the United States. So that's what we're talking about. And if you do have enough money, of course, you can have a bank. And isn't it the most natural thing in the world? I mean, when we step back from it, as historians look over the centuries, isn't it the most natural thing in the world for the people who make a lot of money in one area to use it in another area, and then eventually it becomes a bank, financial. A tendency for economic accumulation to go into the financial is a tendency we have noted in this course. Talking about the rentier economy in the 19th century, talking about financialization in the 1970s. So this is maybe a general point about capitalism. Anyhow, so there we are. There is this third world model. Well, anyhow, Kissinger has an opposite idea. David Rockefeller, Brzezinski, Kissinger, the trilateralist idea is the opposite idea. And they're going to fight this entirely. I want to put together the major economies of the world. They're mostly northern economies around the Atlantic Ocean, Europe, Canada, the United States, etc. All those economies, the biggest economies, called the G7, exclude the Soviets from this. Okay, so it's a Cold War organization, G7. And the notion of the G7 is that it has to somehow control the connections with the LDCs, less developed countries. So less developed countries, no PECs, people who don't have oil. Control those things and make it impossible for Colonel Qaddafi and for Boumediene, for the OPEC radicals, to maintain their relationship with the less developed countries. What are we saying here? These people, these NOPECs, these LDCs, they have to have oil, have to buy oil. And they haven't got the money for it, so somebody's got to lend them the money. The left-wing OPEC group could do that. I mean, economically, it's feasible. So could New York and London lend them the money. That's economically feasible. Which one of those alternatives would the world follow? Well, it has something to do with who has the power. So Kissinger, in effect, is saying, we're going to arrange these various conferences such a way, conferences of the G7, in such a way as to get a certain unanimity, a point of view, ideology, you could say, point of view to prevail that separates these NOPECs, these LDCs, from the OPEC left and ties them to us, ties them to the G7. So Kissinger's notion then is the G7 and the LDCs in a kind of an axis against the OPEC left. That is to say, really against OPEC. But you say, oh, there's more to the OPEC. Didn't I just get through saying that we have the Shah of Iran and we have the Saudis? Aren't they the big oil powers? To be sure. And that is the real strength. Kissinger can divide OPEC. And he's always got this relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, the next question is, why does Saudi Arabia want to play ball with the Kissinger model, with the trilateralist model of a link between the G7 and the LDCs? Why does Saudi Arabia? Is there an economic reason? No. The reason is they depend on the United States. Is it an economic dependence? Well, yes, but there's more to it than that. And maybe this is all underpinned by the persistent noising around that goes on in the American administration during the period of the oil shocks of an invasion of Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis are left to understand that if they don't go along with this thing, they're going to go along, they're very willing, they're very pliable. But if they don't go along with this thing, that in extremis, the United States could always land troops there and overthrow their government. I mean, can anybody else do that? Does anybody else control all the sea lanes, all the naval access routes all over the world with its Navy? No. Soviets are not in that condition. As a matter of fact, Soviets hardly even enter into this discussion. Soviets are still in their position, their mode of recueillement, retrenchment, backing off. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, back off. Let events go in the third world. We'll intervene here and there, be more subtle about things. But they're not in a position to come forward full-throatedly, threaten the United States to defend Colonel Gaddafi and Boumediene, Libya and Algeria, and the OPEC left and their model of organizing the world. No. So what does this tell us? That in the end, in economic terms, Soviet Union, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, is not strong enough to interfere with the United States' attempt to organize the world. That's really what it comes to. That's really what we're saying. So the United States model, which revolves around something far different, it revolves around privatization, around a free trade model rather than all these state agreements, such as the OPEC left might suggest, on outsourcing, even more severe than that, outsourcing, meaning it punishes industry in its own countries, in the G7 countries, and they're telling, in effect, the G7 countries, you may have a good textile industry, for example. You may produce clothes for your population, and the industry works, economically works. But no, we're not going that way because we're going to outsource that industry. We're going to buy textiles from abroad. It's going to be a world scheme of division of labor, a whole conception of petroglobalism that involves not just oil, but everything else. So there it is. There is the whole picture of the Rust Belt in the United States, all of the big industries moving abroad. And similar, in effect, Rust Belt phenomena throughout Western Europe. Do Western Europeans want this? No. Do they have a choice, though? No. The French resisted the idea the most. They're going to be persistently fighting this idea in small ways, but not very effectually. But that has a big impact on our story because while they can't fight this trilateralist model, The French can still try to undermine it in small ways from within, and in the end, maybe organize Europe within this globalized, petro-globalized system, organize Europe against it. So there remains this kind of antagonism that we saw in the 60s between the United States and its picture and Gaullist France and its picture. De Gaulle's gone by this time, but the French are still going to continue to try to undermine things with the price of gold. Eventually, we'll have to figure out a way to punish them on that. We punish them with the oil shocks, so maybe we can punish them with some other thing to fight against this, getting this developing European currency under gold. We can find some way to do that. That's the last point that we will make today. The Volcker Shock, the creation of this enormous interest rate regime that fully subdues, in the end, at least for the moment, subdues the French plans. French, of course, are kicking around a lot of plans. They're going to try a socialist experiment at the beginning of the 80s, but we'll talk about that when we get there. So if you ask the question, are the French on board with the New World Order that is being created by trilateralism, the answer is not exactly. They're not. Although they can't do much to stop it. I said something like that about the Soviets too. They really can't do anything to stop it. And the French, you can do a little bit to stop it, but for the moment, no, they can't stop it. So this looks like quite a juggernaut that has been organized in this trilateral commission. By the way, discussing these things, we're not exactly talking about people who make threats or any of that stuff. We're talking about the way things get organized and discussed, and the way ideology is developed, planning conferences, just being able to have a Rolodex and to get to call a meeting in Pocantico Hills or someplace. It's not to say that you come together exactly to dictate the world, but you come together to kind of form a general conception among the major actors in the world economy, and they're all North Atlantic types, racially speaking, I guess you have to say, they are all racially North Atlantic types, G7 and whatever, and discuss things with them and get them pretty much on the same page, intellectually, spiritually, ideologically. And the person who did this most delicacy and aplomb during this period was David Rockefeller, who organized these very genteel conferences, organized intellectual work, research around some fundamentally rightist ideas, not Keynesian ideas. Rockefeller had been, he got a PhD at Chicago, so he's part of this Chicago school of Milton Friedman. And so that is in general the thinking, the ideological conceptualization of the whole world order that goes with trilateralism. It's an intellectual and spiritual order, I would say. Of course, it is a way of defining how American power will be used in the reshaping of the world. But American power could be used in various ways. This is only one way. Well, at any rate, ideally, Nelson Rockefeller would have been the politician to do this, and Nelson Rockefeller is we would really not even know very much about Henry Kissinger. I would, as an academic, but the world would not know very much about Henry Kissinger if it wasn't for Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller. And all the logic was going toward a Rockefeller presidency at some point, one way or another. Watergate, had opened the way to a Rockefeller, but Rockefeller was pushed out of power. So the trilateralists don't get to run everything. Even in the United States, they can't control the Republican Party. We said there's a cowboy element in the Republican Party that is fighting them and has succeeded through Rumsfeld and Cheney in the Ford administration in getting Rockefeller pushed off the ticket in 1975, just as Henry Kissinger is winning this battle over who's going to organize the world economically, what model, through the G7 and the LDCs. So very interesting confluence there in 1975. What are they going to do, these trilateralists, once Rockefeller's off the scene? Well, there's Henry Kissinger discussing the world with Sheikh Yamani. Sheikh Yamani, every once in a while, is a very interesting source on these discussions. Henry Kissinger is not much of a source. Going through his memoirs, you don't get it much of a guidance on these economic matters. He likes to make it out that he's very ignorant on economic questions, and he sort of is in a way, but who cares to know about every detail of how business works? Kissinger knows about the economics that counts, to be sure. Discussing with Sheikh Yamani, that is the arrangement of the Saudi relationship. And so the things that Sheikh Yamani says during this period are of interest to us. And Sheikh Yamani said very frankly, the U.S. encouraged the oil price, encouraged the Shah of Iran to make a stand in 74, encouraged the oil shocks, set up the whole recycling arrangement. Sheikh Yamani has definitely made a lot of statements. And he's the oil minister for the Saudis. So the historian has to take very seriously that viewpoint. So Rockefeller gone. Now who is it going to be? It's going to be a Democrat. It's going to be Jimmy Carter. I have a picture of Jimmy. There's Jimmy. And in the United States, Jimmy Carter is going to be a new candidate for the American version of trilateralism. So trilateralism was not just a Republican philosophy, it was capable of being a democratic philosophy. As it turns out, almost all of the major leaders, the major cabinet members in the Carter administration were from the Trilateral Commission. So they did their papers and discussed all their issues, and we read all about it. It's nothing conspiratorial about it in the slightest. There's, it's all open stuff. You can read about it in all the various journals. But how does that fit exactly? A trilateralist labor, a trilateralist, how to put it, Democratic Party? What does organized labor think about this trilateralist conception of outsourcing and world division of labor, Ricardian division of labor, free trade, outsourcing, major industry? That's anathema to American labor. And its leader, George Meany, head of the AFL-CIO, is a major Democratic operator during this period. He had to be won over for this thing, and he was won over. Now, he's very much anti-communist, so if it was just a question of opposing the communists, that would be no problem. But now he's got to buy into a whole different kind of regime. He was very tight with Jack Kennedy, of course, and he's going to be relatively tight with Jimmy Carter. And there, of course, he's looking at Jimmy Carter kind of quizzically. That says a lot for us. But it's kind of a devil's bargain that labor has made here, because we're talking about a bad arrangement for American labor economically. Well, what else is there to American labor except the economic relationship? So trilateralism is not going to be very good, but anyhow, that's the way it shaped up. And labor is going to support the Democrats, even while the Democrats are no longer exactly Democrats, at least not as we've understood it in the New Deal tradition. Jimmy Carter will be a neoliberal Democrat. So they're thinking about the suburbs are more important than the working class. The present maladies of the Democratic Party up till recently um, um, can be indicated very clearly in the 1970s with the formation of this new trilateralist Carter presidency. So Carter's a kind of a unique Democratic, kind of right-wing Democrat. He's a almost Milton Friedman kind of Democrat, not really a Keynesian. He oversees outsourcing, etc. I mean, you'd have to say this is what a Republican would have advocated. Certainly what Nelson Rockefeller would have advocated as a Republican president, if that had ever happened. So they get almost the same thing with the Democrats. That's the another interesting thing about petroglobalism is that it creates a new kind of left, that the Democratic Party is no longer the party of Roosevelt or Jack Kennedy or even Lyndon Johnson. Now it's a more rightist kind of party, more neoliberal is the word that is usually used. Now I say neoliberal, it doesn't just mean liberal, but it has to do with what the Europeans would call liberalism, which is a very strict laissez-faire British political economy model from the 1820s, such as preached by a guy named Milton Friedman. So that's what neoliberalism really represents. And that's what the Democrats are buying into. The capitalists get to run the world economy, and there is no scheme of New Deal or management or social democracy or any of that sort of stuff. It's all of the past. The left is now going to be led by people who fully accept the great turn to the right that is being made, economically speaking, in this construction of a new world order. That's quite a moment. And it's international. You see it. We're going to see it in Europe. We're not going to see it today, but we'll talk about it in Europe as well. So Meany is a very important figure. And then we have one other factor to add into the thing, that just at this moment, in a kind of analogous process, labor is fading in Israel. So the Israel that we've been talking about up to this time has been led by labor. Ben-Gurion's a great figure in labor. And labor is going to be faltering. And mainly through foreign policy. Labor has a rather conciliatory attitude toward the Palestinians, or at any rate, more conciliatory attitude toward the Palestinians, or the possibility of a Palestinian state, than other Israelis on the right. And the right's coming forward and organizing in the early 70s in the wake of all these other events we've been talking about. And the figure of Menachem Begin comes to the fore in a reorganization of right-wing parties, which also includes some very strongly militant, in foreign policy that is, left elements. There's a certain labor wing, but it's a labor wing which is extremely left. So there's a new kind of Zionism coming forward around the Likud party, and Menachem Begin is the principal figure. So they represent the revisionist tendency in Zionism of Ziv Jabotinsky, who in the 30s called his view a revisionist view. That's a less conciliatory view and much more hardline about what Israel ought to constitute in the Middle East. Yet it's Israel. That is to say, Israel pretty much from the Mesopotamia to the Nile. So Greater Israel Project, we might say, revisionist Israel. And they call it revisionist Zionism. And Menachem Begin's a revisionist. So you can say they've gone to the right, but strictly speaking, in economics, Jabotinsky was practically a neoliberal. So it means going to the right in that sense, definitely, but also in terms of foreign policy, which means a much more aggressive foreign policy. Israel as not as a small power fighting off powerful neighbors who needs help from outside, but now as a growing power. Remember, it's got nuclear weapons now, as a growing power, which is revisionist. in a way. Now, how could I possibly say that when what followed, the rise of Menachem Begin and Likud, was the Israelis parting with Sinai? Well, they did. And the US administration brokered that arrangement and caused them to meet with Sadat of Egypt. And there's Jimmy Carter overseeing this bargain between Begin and Sadat. So how should we interpret this? The supporters of the Palestinians and the enemies of Zionism in the Mideast regarded Sadat as a traitor, and he was assassinated shortly after this thing. That he'd given up the fight against Israel in return for getting paid off by the Israelis turning the Sinai over to him. There's the Sinai. So remember that Israel controlled the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Sinai after the '67 war. Now it's going to give the Sinai to back to Egypt. In return, though, for Egypt putting itself in a position of a long-term peace. And more than that, abandoning support for the Palestinian militant struggle for an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So that's part of the bargain. So you could argue that Begin sold out and got rid of Sinai, and there were some critics of his who said that, but he could probably argue back, look, we got the United States to drop all of its support for the idea of a Palestinian state, basically, and to pretty much allow us our way with regard to the West Bank and Gaza, in regard to dealing with the Palestinians. So it's really it's an agreement against the PLO. So you could say that maybe Jimmy Carter sold out the PLO or sold out the Palestinian cause, the way the Palestinians would like to think of it. You could put it that way. But Jimmy Carter's opponents, Brzezinski, would probably come back and say, we got a permanent peace out of this whole thing. And of course, we can talk more about the West Bank as we go along. At any rate, there it is. That's the bargain that was arranged there. So that's a kind of an interesting development going on in the Middle East. At the same time, during this period when we have this reshaping economically of the world around the G7 and around the neoliberal model, the world revolution is presumably marching. The Soviets look very quiet in the world, but they're very quietly supporting the Cubans. And they're giving the Cubans most of the wherewithal. All that gear that the Cubans have is usually, most of it is not produced by anything in Cuba. It's all comes from the East Bloc. So Soviets are quietly, carefully helping Cuba. And Cuba is not always clearing things with the Soviets, not always clearing things with the Soviets. Castro maintains, adamantly that the Soviets were against his intervention in Angola in 1975. I don't accept that exactly. I think there's more to that. There's a considerable literature, good literature on it. And there's a lot more to be said about it. But unfortunately, we can't penetrate into all of the ins and outs of the thing in terms of our discussion of globalism and our economic discussion. But at any rate, it's the Cubans that are key to winning over Angola for the MPLA, the movement for the permanent liberation of Angola. And they are leftists who control Angola today. And the South Africans are going to try and come to the aid of the opponents of the MPLA and to fight the Cubans. But the Cubans beat them in the field all the time with this Soviet equipment, T-34s, World War II tanks, 122 millimeter rockets, fired in a bank of 20 on the back of a 2-ton truck, basically. That's no Air Force to speak of. Think of what the United States could have done if it was able to use its Air Force, but Congress did not want to get involved in this and passed an amendment, a Tunney Amendment, which made it impossible for the United States to fight any more than it was doing. It was encouraging the South Africans and the right-wing forces in Angola. It was encouraging them, but it couldn't do much. Well, using the Air Force, it could have done plenty. So these Cubans pretty much got their way, and they got their way in Angola. They got their way in Ethiopia under conditions very roughly similar in Ethiopia. So then Cuba is having quite a career in the revolutionary overthrow of governments throughout Africa. So we see it very strongly, 1974, 1975, 76. It is Cuban leadership, Cuban tank crews, etc., leading Angolan forces, MPLA forces in the civil war in Angola. Remember, Angola is rich in oil, uranium, diamonds, a lot of raw material factors in this conflict. And Castro profited enormously politically from the whole thing. So there he is shaking hands with the Dos Santos of the MPLA, the MPLA leaders. And they know that without him, they would not be in power. So you can see that they absolutely love Fidel. And Nelson Mandela said very frankly at the time, without this Cuban help in Angola against South African forces, without the beating it gave South African forces, the South African regime probably would not have been softened up to the point where they would have abandoned apartheid. So Mandela's struggle against apartheid is aided crucially, in the view of Mandela, as Mandela put it, by Fidel Castro. So huge events in Africa. In fact, sometimes I thought of it at the time as a kind of a scramble for Africa, with much different terms from the 19th century one, which was imperialism running all over Africa. Now it's communism and revolutionary civil war, revolutionary third worldism, whatever we call it. You know, this NAM movement, national, non-aligned movement. Excuse me, not national, but non-aligned movement. So those are the events shaping up in Africa. The Chinese don't like this. It means the Soviets are getting more influential. So they write nasty things about these things in their press, and even contribute in small ways to opposing Castro in Africa. It looks as if that in the Carter administration that Castro is pretty much getting his way. Kissinger could complain that that Jimmy Carter is captive of the myth of the almighty Cuban. And it all came to a head in the spring of 1978 in a place called Katanga Province, Shaba Province, renamed as Shaba Province, in the southern part of the Republic of the Congo today, Zaire used to be. Now this belongs to Congo, belongs to this big state that you see in blue here, that became independent in 1960. It's not independent, and it's not Burundi. But, you know, I've encircled the name Burundi. Burundi refers to another state next door on the other side of the lake, Lake Nyasa. The rising in 78 was presumably arranged by Katangese gendarmes. So these are people who the Congo government under Patrice Lumumba had been attacking, and Moise Tshombe had been organizing in this area. Now this is really an important mineral center, and there's a big mining outfit called the Union Minière du Haut Katanga, which had a lot of influence in politics, as you can imagine, because it represents, you could say this is the mineral center of Africa, strictly speaking. Shaba province, Katanga, Shaba province. So the second Shaba war, well, the first Shaba war was when they tried to became independent of the Congo. Tshombe set up a separate regime here. Lumumba was assassinated by Tshombe during this earlier struggle. And then the Katangi gendarmes were chased out, and the Congo was consolidated under the successors of Lumumba, mainly Joseph Mobutu. And these Katangese gendarmes ended up taking refuge across the border in Angola. So when Castro and the MPLA won in Angola, they got control of these Katangi gendarmes, trained them, and sent them back into Shaba province in the spring of 1978 to try and seize control of that. Wow. Oh, look what we got. Excuse me. Look what we've got we got the Cubans active in Ethiopia. We got the Cubans active in Angola. The supporters are, in Guinea-Bissau. And then, of course, Mozambique under Samora Machel. These are going to be powerful centers of communist, third worldist, Cuban influenced leftist power. And here they're in a position where they're going to take over basically the mineral center of Africa. Strictly speaking, this looks a little bit like what the Germans were doing before World War I. The Germans had 3 colonies here. They would have loved to put a railway, drive a railway between them. If the Germans had won World War I, there would have been a railway in this area, and the Germans would have organized this whole area in the German Empire. But now it looks as if the Cubans were almost going to organize it. There was absolute panic in Paris. And the Parisian version of the Wall Street Journal, the Détente, published an article. Published an article on this phenomenon that led with the sentence, "The Third World War for the resources of the world has now begun in Shaba province." This is in spring of 1978. So this is a huge thing for the Europeans, but also, of course, a huge thing for the world economy. Were they going to be stopped? Who was going to stop them? Well, the French were ready. This tells us something interesting, that the United States was not ready to do anything, not in a position really to act because of the Tunney Amendment, but the French were. So the French organized some Senegalese infantry and parachuted them. Where's Senegal? Organized some Senegalese infantry and parachuted them into Shaba province to put down this rebellion by the Katangese gendarmes and the Cubans, saving, so to speak, this mineral center and the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, saving this big mineral raw materials complex from communism, from the Cubans. And this so shook up Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor of the Carter administration, this economic fact of the idea that not only would the third world radicals and OPEC want to organize the world around oil in a left-wing order, but the Cubans now with Soviet support of some sort or another are going to organize all the raw materials of the world. This is such a huge threat that Brzezinski, absolutely desperate, said that we have no choice now except to play the China card. Chinese oppose this. The U.S. has to throw everything behind China. Now, you would think that Kissinger had already done enough to make Chinese-American relations more smooth, but Carter and Brzezinski decided absolutely, would grant them concessions on all the issues that are outstanding, Taiwan, everything else. we have to play ball. We have to encourage China now. And the Chinese loved this approach by the Americans and said to the Americans that they were being encircled by the Soviets, encircled in the South, they said, when their clients, Pol Pot in Cambodia, were overthrown by the North Vietnamese at the end of 1978. They're being encircled. They're being encircled when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So that's an attempt to encircle China. And then all these Soviet troops on the Chinese border in Siberia. They're being encircled. Deng Xiaoping said, came to the United States, visited the Boeing factory in Washington State, came to New York, was essentially green-lighted to attack Vietnam over this Cambodia issue, which it did in January of 1979. And at the same time, switching out of the geopolitics of it to the economics of it, which I think is connected, the Chinese made the crucial decision to restore capitalism, mainly in the treaty ports areas on the China coast. They made its essentially vital turn toward capitalism in the Chinese economy. So it's related to these events, playing the China card, what Brzezinski called playing the China card, and the Chinese attack on Vietnam, and then the Chinese decision to go capitalist, at least to some extent, to go capitalist. Now, to what extent have the Chinese made this decision to go capitalist in 1978? Well, Deng was questioned on it a lot, and he had a lot to say on it. The most important thing that people in the West remember that people in the West, they're doing business. Money is going to be made by these various political things. And so the people in the West, there's a tendency to try to, cherry pick the evidence and look for something in there that justifies your desire to make money. After all, they're only human. In the worst sense, I guess, but then they're only human. And to look for these things. So this has always been the quotation that was tossed forward to explain, so to speak, for the West what's going on in China, that they don't give a damn about communism, and that they don't care. Communism or capitalism, whichever does the job. Oh, wouldn't it be perfect for them if the whole world was really like this, which is not absolutely nonsense, that it doesn't matter to people. No, that's nonsense. But the Chinese didn't mind the United States believing this stuff, and they found it easy enough to convince US leaders of a whole lot of things. Communists in general have had, this is one of the things, one of the virtues. I'm not virtues, I don't know if it's a virtue, but one of the features of communist perspectives about the West is many of them have had the feeling throughout the Cold War they could almost tell the West anything they wanted. They have the notion that they're all a bunch of corrupt people who want to make money, and if you just dangle some money in front of them, you can tell them anything and they'll believe it. There's this is a point to some degree. Anyhow, nearly always people go back and they say, Deng Xiaoping, what he really thinks it is, that communism or capitalism, it's a matter of indifference, whichever works. Wouldn't they love it if he thought that way? No matter if it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as it can catch mice, it's a good cat. But he was questioned more deeply by his colleagues in the Chinese Communist Party. And he said other things on this topic. And I think these cohere much more closely with what the Chinese can be really said to think about these things today. And even then, too. No matter to what degree China opens up to the outside world and admits foreign capital, which it's going to do, its relative magnitude will be small. To be sure, foreign capital does not dominate, never dominated, never had a chance of dominated China was always reduced to light industry, to minor industries. Never really had a decent foothold in banking or anything like that. Always was given, had it dangled in front of them. Now the Chinese were going to let them into these fields, but no, that was all part of their temptation of the West. No matter to what degree the Chinese open up, the magnitude will be small. It won't affect our system of socialism and public ownership of the means of production. All right, that's an intention. Now, I'm not saying that capitalism wouldn't work its magic of whatever sort, completely apart from this. I'm not denying that to any degree. But here's another thought. Dong also said, in China, we intend to acquire advanced technology, science, and management skills to serve socialist production. These things as such have no class character. There is something for consumption by Chinese party colleagues, friends of China, friends of revolutionary China or whatever, socialist China. Is it true? No class character to technology, and none to science, none to management. Well, strictly speaking, in Marxism, you'd have to say absolutely. It's absolutely true. The important thing is the dictatorship of the proletariat. They could allow the capitalists to run the economy in a theoretical way. But practically speaking, dialectically, we would say, what does that mean when the capitalists run the economy? At some point, the ambition is going to arise to run the polity as well. Or at any rate, there's going to be some kind of a tension, some kind of a antagonism, some kind of a give and take. And I think we continue to see this, even today, continue to see this in China. But at any rate, those are some ideas about China phenomenon, China going over. That's a big milestone. I'll show you some statistics on it because they don't mean anything for the period we're talking about, the 70s, but they'll mean a lot when we get past the turn of the century. All right, so big events. China is observing, before we drop this topic, I think we should make one further observation, one further thought. China is observing the Tiger model, of which the Trilaterals are absolutely in love with. But the Trilateral movement can't be completely happy with the Tiger model, as excited as it was by it. It's all based on imitating Japan. So it's going to be Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, these tiger economies. And they're all going to be producing essentially under a scheme, this is the Japanese Zaibatsu model, under a scheme of war economy, basically, but organized for export. And this only works if you're exporting to the United States market. So the United States is the export sink, according to the Tiger model. It develops in Japan, imitated beautifully, to the last detail in South Korea and elsewhere in other places. Any place where there's overseas Chinese, it's very easy to organize this model. They're all in commerce, and there's a lot to contribute to it. And then what emerges with the Chinese turn at this point in 1978 is that what they are thinking about, and what they were saying in their press even, was that this Tiger model, it made sense for them as well, that if, and the essential thing is the export sink, isn't it? It's not how you organize the economy for export. I mean, Chinese can figure out a way to organize it for export, but the crucial question to it is, are you going to have that US market to be able to sell all your goods. And the Japanese, then the tigers imitating the Japanese, and then the whole tiger model instructing China, in effect, paves the way very nicely for the Chinese to make this turn and to help their economy in a big way through the American market. So that's a change that comes in 1978. Now, for communists to do this, it's a tough call, and it's not just, you can't just say if the cat catches mice or whatever, it doesn't matter. No, they've got to argue this in front of their communist colleagues. And the way the Chinese did it at this time was they brought up the example of Lenin in the 1920s and the NEP, the New Economic Policy. Lenin instituted a form of capitalism on the countryside, not instituted, but permitted a form of capital, in the cities too. On the countryside, the peasants were allowed to trade, after paying a tax in kind, they were allowed to trade their grain for free profit and to build up private fortunes, to operate land privately. They didn't get exact capitalist ownership in the way you might conceive of it in the West, but right next door to it. And in the cities, there was the phenomenon of the net men, the NEP men, and these were artisans, petty traders, middlemen of various sorts who conducted this grain trade. And that's how grain was provided for the cities. The commanding heights of the economy, so-called, as Lenin described them at the time, heavy industry, banking, all the rest of that, railroads, blah, blah, blah. None of that stuff was permitted to fall into the hands of capitalists. So it was, in effect, the cities were seas of socialism, dictatorship of the proletariat, in an ocean of capitalism, petty capitalism in the countryside. Now, Lenin said at the time, if this goes on for a long period of time, the capitalists will eventually take over. That it's an incremental process that the dictatorship of the proletariat, the city, that is, will lose at some point. So there's every reason for neoliberals in the West to assume that China had made a huge turn and that in the long run, eventually China's going to become capitalist. And on the basis of studying Lenin, you could have made Lenin's NEP, New Economic Policy. You could have made that argument. I only bring this up because in front of communists, to make a change like this couldn't be done unless you could find some way to say that there's a Lenin precedent to it, or some kind of a Russian communist precedent for doing it, and that's how they did it. I mention this because the Russians are going to do the same thing. Under Andropov and then under Gorbachev, they're also going to cite NEP, and they're going to come forward with various schemes for permitting private enterprise in Russia. So it's interesting for the thinking of the communists, in the communist theory, how they have to work it out theoretically in order to slip it by, and put it into operation. Well, all right, dropping this topic for the moment, or at any rate turning slightly from this topic, let's go back to this notion of the world revolution that the Chinese are now kind of against, strictly speaking. They disapprove of it. Right? They're not internationalists in the same sense as we imagined them in the 1950s. That doesn't mean that the revolution doesn't continue. And in 1979, we found the Sandinistas in power in Nicaragua. And more importantly than that, for our purposes, the Shah of Iran was overthrown. And might argue, Brzezinski did argue, that this is the same kind of revolutionism that we are familiar with. You might say it is not at all the kind of revolution we're familiar with. It's a religious, Islamic, revolutionary Islamic regime, Islamic revolution. We're not familiar with anything like that. At any rate, from the standpoint of the United States, its interests, the fall of the Shah, crucial blow. The United States depended on the Shah to establish this world order. You'll remember from our discussion of last week, the United States depended on the Shah. he's gone now, and he's replaced by a man who hated the United States in the most thoroughgoing way. You know, and he felt the same way about the communists. The United States supplied all kinds of information to him about communists and helped him wipe them out mercilessly, but that didn't help at all with relations between the United States and Khomeini. These are giant changes in terms of the world balance of forces, and maybe even the balance of forces regionally in the Mideast. And moreover, the disruption of Iranian oil production in the overthrow of the Shah caused a second oil shock. So all the horrible effects of the first oil shock, which have been mitigated to some degree, now they come back in full fury. And an enormous crisis envelops the world at the end of the 80s. You could put it in geopolitics. You could say Soviet Union's running the table in Africa. The Cubans do anything they want. We've lost the war in Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia. The dominoes have all fallen. Cambodia, Laos, etc. The revolution has completely taken control of everything, and now even Soviet troops have even invaded Afghanistan. So you might argue that this is a tremendous moment of, the French would call it, I guess, a due date. What does this mean for the world economy in general? And how can we sum this thing up? Does it mean that globalism has been constructed or reconstructed? We've got the first, it was constructed, we've been arguing, in its first layer by the Nixon-Kissinger years and the oil shocks. And now it's constructed in its second layer, and it features the Chinese participation in the whole thing. Has it succeeded with the Europeans? Has it got the French on board? Have they learned anything from the experience of Kolwezi, for example? And I don't know that we can say yes to that question, because the project that came to the fore at the end of the 70s, at the end of the Carter administration, which was, maybe it was the crucial thing against the Carter administration, although many would say the failure of the SALT II negotiations were what murdered the Carter administration, that the last thing was this tremendous bolt in the gold price. So here's a graph that shows the gold price coming up to $800 an ounce. Now it's a different graph if you use 2016 dollars. Let's use the dollars that were used at the time. So look at the lower part of the graph, the blue line, rather than the red line. And it still gives you the indication of reaching a high point in 1980, 1981, $800 an ounce. That is the value of the dollar. So that's an attack on the dollar. Who's mounting this attack on the dollar? We could have said, if we were asking this question in 1968, 69, we say the French, well, Europe generally, but led by the French. Are we saying the same thing now? Europe generally may be led by the French, and especially led by projects that were thought to be in the air for the establishment of a European currency. We're not going to see that for 10 years, but a European currency backed by gold, and that maybe all this gold buying is a prelude to the death agony of the dollar, the end of the dollar, and the replacement of it by a European currency. So this is an analogous threat to the dollar, to the threat that was made at the end of the 60s. Isn't that interesting? So it's like a 10-year cycle, this threat to the dollar. But as you can see from the blue line does not continue upward. When we get to $800 in 1980, just as the Carter administration is losing the election, Ronald Reagan is going to take over power, we see a raise in American interest rates, or we don't see it here, but we're going to see it, a raise in American interest rates, the so-called Volcker Shock. Paul Volcker, as head of the Fed, will be raising interest rates, and they'll go up toward 20%, and that will save the dollar. Well, the argument is, of course, it's trying to save inflation, and it is. It's working against inflation. Here's a diagram to show the inflation. So the argument that Keynesian stagflation, of course, ran aground in the 70s, and that's why globalism, petroglobalism took over from Keynesianism, that argument. Not much evidence for it according to this graph. You see the inflation's all never gets more than about 5% through the whole 60s, and then when in the 70s, when it does get out of hand, it just explodes suddenly, and that's with oil. So it's the oil shock we're talking about, not Keynesian stagflation, although stagflation, so to speak, there is. There's another graph that shows stagflation. You see the oil price going through the ceiling in 1980, up to 1980, which at the same time depresses GDP growth. You see the graph for GDP is going through the floor. So obviously that's the point. You know, the oil shock is creating depression in the West. That's the big message. But you also see that it comes right down in the 80s. So as Ronald Reagan takes over, it comes down. It's this oil shock. It's the interest rates. This is going to be a shaping of petroglobalism, a reshaping of petroglobalism as a kind of a financialized phenomenon under the aegis of this presumed Volcker shock of 1980-81. What do the Soviets think about all of these machinations? What the hell is going on with capitalism? Do they think capitalism is falling apart? And the answer is usually yes. I followed the Soviet literature very closely during this period. Consensus is capitalism is in its death agony. And the whole question that emerged for them was, should we allow states that are socialists, especially the socialist Eastern Bloc, Soviets and countries like Poland, should we allow them to borrow money from the West under these circumstances? Remember, they've got all this OPEC money, and they're hawking loans all over the world. These sovereign loans. Should we get in on this and get them to lend us some money? And the answer that they give is yes. Yes, these capitalists are so craven, so the argument ran. It just sounds amazing to us today, but there it is. These capitalists are so craven that they will sell you the rope, as Lenin put it. They will sell you the rope with which to hang them. This is actually proceeding at the moment. They are hanging themselves, and we can sell them the rope. We can borrow from them at this moment of their extreme imposture. They're going to turn out to be wrong about this. But that was definitely the conviction among the Soviets. Moreover, they're even going to start, within about a year or so, they're going to start kicking around this idea of the NEP and Lenin's ideas about the NEP. Maybe we should do something like what the Chinese are doing and get into this American market or something like that. So that's going to come up for the Soviets as well. So the next phase that we have to explain is this financialization, if you want to put it that way, of this petroglobal order that we're describing as unfolding. It's going to be another fuite en avant, as the French say, another escape forward for the leaders of the world economy. But we can't talk about it today. We'll have to talk about it when we continue this next time.